This is chapter 13 of the Initiate, Some Impressions of a Great Soul, and it's written by Cyril Scott. This is chapter 13. The name of this chapter is My Sister's Letter. Pemberley Manor, Warwickshire, Tuesday. My dear Charlie, you don't deserve to get a letter from me at all, because it never seems to occur to you to send even a few lines to ask how we are, which I think extremely remiss. However, I know it is no use scolding. You are just incorrigible where letter writing is concerned, and I hope you realize I am returning good for evil in not remaining utterly silent. That is to say, as silent as you. And in brackets it says, the fact is, my sister, as a rule, writes such very arid letters that I do not wish to encourage her by answering them, apart from which I candidly dislike writing letters myself. End of brackets. All the same, if you don't answer this letter, you will be in my very worst of all books for a long time to come. So I tell you this at once. The fact is, you old miscreant, I have met the extraordinary man you have been so full of for the last 6 months. At least you were the one time I saw you, and everybody tells me you always are. Well, he has been down here for the weekend, and I don't wonder now that you are so taken up with him. He is quite the most remarkable creature I have ever met. Everyone down here is fascinated with him. For one thing, he is not a bit like anyone else in the world. At all events, not anyone I have ever seen. And you know how refreshing it is to come across somebody who's different from the usual lot of dull people one meets at house parties. Of course, I am dying to ask you loads of questions about him, but I suppose if I don't tell you a lot of news first, you simply won't answer them. Besides, I believe for once you will be really interested in my letter. In brackets. Perhaps for once I shall be, I thought. End bracket. Well, I came down here on Friday, and he arrived the next day. Until his arrival, I thought I was in for a deadly weekend. There were the Julian Smiths, whom I never could like, and that boring Miss Clifford, how ugly and tedious she is, and then old Mr. Sandlands. I am sure he is dotty. Charity is certainly not one of your virtues, I thought. End of brackets. And finally, Lady Eddisfield. It was she who brought him, though how he can be such a friend of hers, really, she such a friend of his, I can't say. At least I couldn't say then. But after seeing him for 2 days, I have discovered that he makes everyone his friend. I have never seen anything like it. I wonder what it feels like to be fond of everyone you meet, sort of thing. In brackets. Well, why don't you try and see? I thought. End of bracket. End brackets. Well, he arrived just in time for tea with his companion, Lady E. And what a couple they were. She always on the go in a perfect whirlpool of excitement and fidgets, shouting at the top of her voice, and he calm as a mill pond. Somehow he seemed as if he were a spectator at the zoo, looking at a lot of monkeys jumping about inside the cage. He had such a sense of aloofness about him. I don't mean superiority or conceit, of course. Brackets. No, I should think not, I thought. End of brackets. But of being a sort of onlooker. And then, when he began to talk, first of all, he has such a soothing voice. And secondly, everything he says seems so extraordinary, and he never uses slang. It was too funny. I noticed after a little that everybody began to drop their slangy way of talking as if they were ashamed to go on like that in front of him. And then another thing, he never would join in when the others began to run down people. He simply kept silent and looked at them all, like one looks at a lot of children when they babble nonsense or try to show off. It wasn't exactly a bored expression, but a sort of indulgent one. It was too amusing to see them all drop running down people after a bit, but they did with the slang. Brackets. It is a pity you have not dropped it permanently too, I thought, since it is such a futile occupation. End bracket. After tea, we took a stroll in the garden, and into the woods, and then I told him I was your sister, and he said heaps of most awfully nice things about you, which I am sure you don't deserve in the least. Bracket, thank you. I thought, perhaps he knows me a good deal better than you do, if truth be told. End bracket. Then he seemed to take an enormous interest in me. I was really quite flattered. Besides, he looked at me in such an affectionate sort of way. I thought he must be a bit of a flirt at first. But when I found he looked at everybody like that, well, never mind what I thought. Bracket, you were a bit sold, I opined. End bracket. I wondered if he were an artist or poet or something of that kind, because as we walked about, he showed me all sorts of beautiful glimpses and things I had never noticed before. But when I asked Lady E what he was, she said he was nothing, or perhaps she said merely a gentleman of means, or at large, or something like that. I really can't remember what she said, and it doesn't matter. At dinner, he told us the most extraordinary things. He is really the most brilliant conversationalist I ever met. And never once does he talk of himself. I think even the butler got so interested he forgot to wait properly, and I saw Lady Drummond frown at him, the butler I mean, once or twice very severely, and he took me into dinner, so I was sitting next to him, and I noticed he let all the meat courses pass, and only took vegetables and sweets. So I asked him why he didn't eat meat, and he just smiled and said it was a pity to kill unoffending animals. Wasn't it extraordinary? You never told me he was a vegetarian. After dinner, we all sat in the Bill Hall over fire. It was a bit chilly, so they had lighted it. And then he told us all sorts of wonderful things about ghosts and Mahatmas and fakirs he had seen on his travels in India. Really interesting. I had never believed in that sort of thing before, but somehow, when he talks about it, it is all quite different, and one thinks it must be true. We sat up listening to him all hours of the night, and when we went to bed, Henry called him the charming lunatic. I thought of what you had called him, the wise imbecile, or infant, or the innocent, wasn't it? All the same, Henry was awfully impressed, although he pretended not to be. On Sunday, a rather funny thing happened. He came down to breakfast, and then, when it was over, he disappeared for the rest of the morning. I was walking in a part of the garden nobody goes to as a rule, and fancy, all of a sudden I came upon him. He was sitting cross-legged like a tailor, but bolt upright, with his eyes shut, and not leaning against anything, but as still as if he were asleep. Well, somehow, I didn't like to say anything, so I moved off. However, I was so curious, I went back there again in about half an hour, and lo and behold, he was in exactly the same position as when I had left him. And I am sure he had never moved. Do tell me, whatever was he doing? I think it most extraordinary, and I was dying to ask him afterwards, but somehow I didn't like to. Brackets. And if he told you, you wouldn't understand, I thought, end brackets. Well, this epistle is getting very long, so I shall stop now, but I want to know all about him. Whatever is he, and what does he do, and how old can he be? And tell me, is he very rich? And who and what are his people? I can't get anything out of Lady E. She puts on a silly air of mystery when I ask her, but I don't believe she knows anything, and wants to cover up that fact. Well, now, goodbye, and remember, if you don't answer me, I shall never forgive you. Much love from your affectionate sister, Ethel. P.S. Why don't you come and spend a weekend with us? It is ages since you've been.